Coming up on episode 78 of Omnivore, the top food and beverage trends expected to drive sales and product innovation in 2026, and why alternative meat has become a long game shaped by financing cycles and technology timelines. This is Omnivore, from the editors of Food Technology Magazine and the Institute of Food Technologists.
This episode of Omnivore is brought to you by IFT FIRST, food improved by research, science, and technology. Join the leading food science and innovation expo, IFT FIRST, at McCormick Place in Chicago, July 12th through 15th, for the industry's premier event connecting innovation, science, and business. Learn more at ift.org.
Welcome to Omnivore from IFT and Food Technology, where we explore the intersection of business, science, and technology in the global food system. I'm Bill McDowell. Frustrated by economic constraints in a world filled with anxiety and uncertainty, consumers have some pretty high emotional, functional, and sensory expectations for food and beverages in 2026. Sure, they still want culinary excitement, health and wellness benefits, global flavors, and of course, the things that never change, taste and convenience. But they also want all of that with minimal risk and price points that meet their budgets. Dr. Liz Sloan, president of Sloan Trends Incorporated, outlines the top 10 food and beverage trends in the new issue of Food Technology, and recently spoke with executive editor Mary Ellen Kuhn about what marks a departure in consumer behavior, what surprised her in this year's list, and where the most significant opportunities lie.
Hi, Liz. Welcome to the podcast. It's always great to have the opportunity to talk trends with you. So, what do you see as the biggest change from trends in recent years?
Well, I think you made a statement about this year's trends seem to be somewhat of a departure from what they were last year and even then. And, you're right on target. I couldn't agree with you more. Economic restrictions, the price concerns in the food industry have really caused the consumers to change some of their priorities. Right now, there's still 69% that are very or extremely concerned about the price of food, retail food products in the United States. And a little less than that, about 45% concerned about the price of restaurants. But what they tend to do is avoid that, right? If it becomes too expensive to them. So truthfully, we are living through a market reset, and it's going to be a transitionary year. So it is going to be a little bit different. And the way I look at it, I think it's a really good thing for the industry because it does two things for us, in my experience. First, it tells us what consumers really want. When they're on a limited budget, they're not going to go something's flaming and super high spice if it really, really isn't important to them. So it kind of focuses us. The second thing, and this has kind of always been interesting to me, traditionally, it identifies very large, quick fix situations that if you fix them, it's really going to affect your bottom line in the food world. And what do I mean by that? I think if you look at some of the numbers, half of shoppers, for example, find deli prepared fresh foods only moderately appetizing. That's a $58 billion business. Just think if, we could work on finding things that were a little more desirable from a cuisine standpoint.
Well, that's a great overview. One of the trends that you mentioned is the next generation comfort foods. So what are consumers looking for these days when it comes to comfort food?
Well, I think there's one thing that we can't do, and that's underestimate the power of comfort foods. I think we have to watch how we focus on it. We've seen too many marketers lately try to jump on comfort foods, and they end up creating something that's really, really wild flavors and mixing it with other cuisines and all. And I think that's kind of lost some of the concerns that consumers have today that, it's too spicy, it's too this, it's whatever. So I always like to think it's very important to do it by generation, right? The younger folks are more interested in Mexican handheld classics or Asian noodle classics or dishes, and the older ones we know are sandwiches and all kinds of other things.
So, what's driving the strong interest in consumer snacking? And that's including some snackable functional beverages.
First of all, it is well documented now that there are fewer main meals being eaten in the United States. Okay, for example, only 5 in 10 eat a regular breakfast, 6 in 10 eat lunch, and a little over 6 in 10 are eating dinner, and about 40% are snacking. But what's happening is that the snacks themselves, the number of snacking occasions really isn't up. It's that people are choosing other things, more foods for their snack habits, and more non-traditional snack foods for their snack habits. And that's making it go up. The opportunity is larger still because for the first time this January 26th, the Bureau of Labor Statistics tell us that we have more people in the U.S. workforce than we ever have had in history.
So, it sounds like people are replacing some meals with snacks.
Yep, absolutely. About, depends on your reckoning, about 62% of Americans, so 2/3 of Americans say that they are doing this more than they ever have in the past. And that's really important for the industry. Where are the opportunities, right? So the first one I think of when I think of snacks now, especially snacks going to meals, is food service. Because what's happening is the snack segment of the restaurant business is the fastest growing segment.
Well, I'd like to go back to that trend that you touched on a little bit when we first started talking, and that's about targeting the aging consumers. So would you say that this group tends to be overlooked despite the fact that it's a large market segment?
I think that they are clearly overlooked. And even worse than that, I think that the general understanding of marketers as to what they're looking for, we're really misunderstanding that, the priorities that they have. So I think there's 4 things that are really, really important. First of all, we have to recognize that older consumers choose foods for physical health, not for lifestyle issues like being tired or a lot of these other things. And so when you look at what they're really looking for in a more medical sense of the word, or many of the conditions that they had. And as I mentioned before, heart health comes up number 1, but yet where are all the low cholesterol products that we had of yesteryear, you know? They're just not there. Bones is number 2. It's hard to find a good calcium product these days. For some reason, even Quaker Oats has taken the hearts off a lot of their packaging. You know, weight, blood sugar levels, immunity, and to some of the new ideas of home remedies for urinary tract infections and some of these things. That's what they're buying a lot of food for, not some of the lifestyle effects.
Well, another one of the trends that you talk about in the top 10 are special occasion opportunities. So what are your thoughts on product development opportunities for the many home entertainers who are celebrating special occasions?
I have been fascinated with the whole home entertaining world. Last year, 6 billion eating occasions in the U.S., and that's before all the big sports things that are going on this year and everything was involved in home entertaining. And if you think about it, there's so many things that are sort of missing right there. Well, first of all, let's go back. This year, we have the birthday of the United States, and that's going to be in July. So people are going to be doing all kinds of backyard barbecues and everything. And there's so much entertaining. We have the Olympics, and now we have the success of the hockey team. You know, we think of all the nutritional products that could come out of there, or the snack bars or whatever. I mean, it's like a gold mine. We even have the Special Olympics in the United States coming up this year. So there's a lot of occasions. But I think when you think about what they're doing on entertaining occasions, they are definitely serving food. After you get through the birthdays like cake, pie, and ice cream, they are serving meats. Pork is the number 1, by the way, comes to their mind. Burgers, pizza, potatoes. But most interestingly, they are twice as likely to serve something more of a global meal than they are for their own family at home. And they're twice as likely to serve fish or seafood. The one big thing I see that's missing, and it frustrates me, is that if you're having people over, we used to have all these beautiful bake in the oven dishes, maybe stuffed ricotta chicken or breast or something like that. And they're just not out there.
Okay, well, let's transition a little bit to kind of the health and wellness area. And you had a trend on your top 10 list called prescription nutrition. But one thing I found interesting was that you don't call out a lot of opportunities around GLP-1 medication consumers. Why not?
If you look at any basic weight loss food or beverage in general, what everybody's calling for the GLP-1 products from a food standpoint are exactly what they would be if we were Weight Watchers or some other type of product line. So the differentiation just isn't there to build up this massive movement that they think is going to be there. And by that, I mean things like small portion, high protein, high fiber, nutrient density, no sugar, about 6%, according to FMI and some of the other groups, and it's all self-reported, say that they've been on these drugs. Okay, 13% said they say they've tried some kind of weight loss drug. Could be, there's hundreds of weight loss drugs. So that number is just too small to push an enormous trend at this point in time without enough more differentiation. The idea of it driving this enormous bubble in purchasing these particular types of products doesn't make any sense.
Well, what do you see as the most significant opportunities when it comes to targeting consumers who have a strong interest in health and wellness?
And when you think about the huge size of the energy market already, I think that's a big idea. Energy is on the top, fastest growing of these conditions. Sleep is number 2. That's one that's a little elusive for food, but there are some actually really sound scientific connections. Inflammation, anxiety, which we've all been working on anxiety beverages, right? Mood and stress. So targeting any of those, especially the beverage business right now with mood and some of the other things, those are growing and they're going to continue to grow. So they're worth an investment right there. The other thing that's kind of alongside of that, which is very, very interesting because it's jumped 10 points in the last 2 years, is people looking to foods or beverages or food components, I should say, food ingredients for specific medical purposes. 1 in 4 in the United States adults are still on some form of special diet. Obviously, it's protein, but what's moved up in the past year really close, like about a little over 50% are trying to get more protein. Are you ready for this? Gluten-free. And it's not a genuine, as we would all know, it's not that many people perhaps really truly have that allergy. It's obviously starting to represent other things like cleaner foods, less ingredients to be avoided. And then, of course, we all know, despite our upside down food pyramid now, that people want more fiber, obviously, especially the 80% who want more fiber over age 50. But the prediction is that fructooligosaccharides and then tapioca soluble fibers will be the type of fiber that leads that ingredient list. So there are some interesting hotspots, if you will, coming up.
Thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Liz Sloan is president of Sloan Trends Incorporated and a contributing editor at Food Technology, focusing on the intersection of consumer trends and food innovation. Check out her take on all of the top 10 food and beverage trends for 2026 in our March-April issue. We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment. But first, this word from our sponsor.
IFT, the Institute of Food Technologists, invites you to join your colleagues across the Food Science Network at IFT FIRST this July 12th to 15th at Chicago's McCormick Place. For the first time, all scientific programming will happen directly in the expo hall, creating seamless connections between research and real-world applications. You'll have the opportunity to learn about cutting-edge science, then immediately explore available solutions with exhibitors in one dynamic environment. Get connected with cutting-edge tech, global leaders, and the innovations shaping our food future. Registration is open, Secure your spot today at IFT.org. That's IFT.org.
Welcome back to Omnivore. I'm Bill McDowell. Recent market setbacks for alternative meat companies have made for some easy headlines. A few high-profile shutdowns, slower sales, and suddenly the whole category looks like a fad. But our next guest argues that this moment is being misread, and that what we're really seeing is the tension between financial cycles and long technology timelines. John Ruff is a retired senior vice president of R&D at Kraft Foods and a past president of IFT. In a recent op-ed for Food Technology, Ruff draws on decades of product development experience to explain why alternative meat will likely be defined by hybrids, mycoproteins, incremental improvements, and products consumers choose because they taste great, not because they're told they should. Science and Technology editor Julie Larson-Brisher spoke with Ruff about why patience, product discipline, and realism, not hype, will shape the future of alternative meat.
Well, hi, John. Welcome to the Omnivore podcast.
Oh, thanks, Julie. I'm excited, and I'm excited because this morning I realized that although I've done countless media interviews over my long career, I've never actually done a podcast. I guess I'm a bit of a dinosaur, but
Oh, that's great. And I'm glad it's at one of your former homes of IFT.
Yeah.
You know? Well, I'm going to dive right in here. I really enjoyed your dialogue op-ed, Alt Meat's a Long Game, in the latest issue of Food Technology. And in that issue, you note that you have worked on meat analogs going back 5 or 6 decades.
Right.
So when you look at today's alt meat conversation, what feels genuinely new and what feels like, history's repeating itself?
right. Well, that's a great first question because I would sort of argue that almost everything, not just the alt meat category, but everything to some degree, has been around before to some level. I think it's King Solomon was the one who quoted, "There's nothing new under the sun," and that's pretty broadly true about a lot of things about food. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the number one driver of food today, of purchase intent, why people buy food, is taste. The number one reason why people ate particular foods 10,000 years ago was taste. Why? Because taste was the way they knew whether it would kill them or it would be nutritious. They learned by trial and error, unfortunately, with some of them not passing the test, that bitter things were poisonous and toxic in general, and sweet things were nutritious. And so, that's where we got our dislike of bitter, like of sweetness from. And, that's from the very start. And it's as true today as it is then. It really hasn't changed. And consumers basically drive food purchase by taste, number one still today. If you look at the other side, the science and all the scientific inventions, I mean, science itself is an evolutionary process. You develop theories and hypotheses, you look at the data, you refine them, you change them. Again, there's nothing that new in science. And if you think specifically about the area you're talking about, which is sort of alternatives. I mean, if you look at fermentation, for instance, which, there's a fair bit, I talk a fair bit about the cell-based meats, which are, based on advanced precision fermentation. But I think we all know that fermentation is thousands of years old. It was one of the first preservation systems. It really isn't new. It has evolved. It's become more sophisticated, but it's not particularly new. We've been eating plants for, about 10,000 years, I think it is. I mean, we started with meat, but then we got onto plants. So we've been eating plants, and plants became the primary form of protein for a long time, really, until probably about 150 years ago when we kind of went back to heavy meat eating, etc. So in that respect, you could argue there's nothing new. I think what is new today, though, is it's really the combination of the two. And it's really the balance between consumers' understanding of what's going on and concern about the environment. They're concerned about it. They understand it much better today around the world not necessarily just in the Western countries, but the developing countries are, equally in some cases more concerned than some parts of the Western world. And it's the balance between that and today the ability for those technologies that are thousands of years old to have got to a point in their advancement where they can actually produce products that taste good enough for people to do. And I think we're seeing that. We saw that, say, 5 years ago, when basically Impossible and Impossible Burger and forgetting the other one. Beyond Meat, yeah. If you want to redo that, we can do it. But when Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat basically came out with two protein-based meats that really were the closest we'd had in history, way closer than those that I was working on 50 years ago, which generally speaking had to be mixed to really be any good. And that is really what sort of triggered that. And that's what's going to always, I think, trigger the development and the maturity or the success of new and novel foods.
Well, now, and you've brought up two of those early innovators, but in the article, you argue that the shutdown of companies like Believer Meats reflects a financing cycle, not a failure of the technology itself. So how should food scientists interpret moments like this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me just sort of, because I think people may question my logic, there if they read it. But, if you look at it, the venture capital business, most of it, the significant money historically, once it started as a form of funding, went into high-tech businesses. It went into digital IT, AI now, pharma, which was relatively high-tech. And, those are much more predictable than food. I think that's the problem. I've already talked about, how food evolves and the long cycle that you get into. So when they went into food, which probably started, 5 to 10 years ago, they started getting into things like venture capital started going into equipment for testing foods and so forth, suppliers to the food industry. And those, again, because they were technologically based, were quite well. They've always funded small inventors, but that's pretty small fry. But when the meat analog or the Believer Meats, not Believer Meats, when the Impossible Burger, the Beyond Burger came, they basically got heavy funding because they really were good enough to make a breakthrough. And they did pretty well to start with. And of course, COVID helped them. I think most people realize there was a big boom in COVID, which when COVID ended and the meat became more available and, affordable as well, it dropped. And it sort of made people then think, well, okay, so this is now over. The boom is over. It's not going to be anywhere near as successful. Wrong answer. It just went too far up and it's correcting itself. It's still going to be there and it's going to grow and grow and grow. But so the venture capital had already been burned then, and then they go into the cell-based meats. And the cell-based meats, they just were so totally over-optimistic on the timescale and whatever. And so the combination of looking at what had happened in the plant-based and so forth, and issues and delays that the Believer Meat Company and people had in particular, they just eventually pulled the plug. And it was simple as that. The technology has evolved incredibly well. They can make meats now. They can make proteins that really are getting closer to, they're in the order of magnitude of, meat. They're not as cheap yet. And it will continue to grow. So, I don't think, as a product developer, as a researcher, as a food scientist, you should be despondent about it. But yeah, it's the lesson to learn is to recognize that a lot of things take a lot longer than you ever think, particularly in the world of food.
Right. And just based on the title of your op-ed, you were really clear that food innovation is a long game. So in practical terms, what does, quote unquote, patience mean for R&D teams working on these alt proteins right now?
Right. Well, I learned over my career, and I think, I would get ideas about things and I would try and sell them, particularly, and when I was more junior, I wasn't usually very successful because, even my own leaders might not listen, and certainly the business leaders wouldn't. And if I got poo-pooed, I'd forget it. And the second time, if I had the idea and something, I'd sort of push a bit harder and harder. And the third time, I'd never give up. And sort of, that rule is sort of, it's like third time lucky, has always worked for me. And I think probably the best way of illustrating is a story I love, and I'm going to tell it here. And it's about the self-rising pizza that DiGiorno launched in the 90s, which really transformed the pizza business from being, cheap and nasty sort of thing. I mean, they used to talk about frozen pizzas being like the crust being like cardboard, wet cardboard, and it was. They just weren't good. Rising crust changed all that. Now, the irony of that, Rising Crust, which was launched in the 90s, was launched when the general manager of the business challenged a team meeting of a new division that had been formed to market pizza, because they wanted to grow it, to find a pizza that tasted as good as delivery, which, by the way, became the tagline. Her challenge became the tagline when they actually achieved it and launched it. But in the audience was a young scientist who 25 years ago had been in the old General Foods, pre-Kraft part of, Kraft, General Foods and Kraft merged, and had worked on frozen pastry crust. General Foods was trying to compete with Pillsbury. They were trying to develop something like their refrigerated line. And they actually were quite successful to some degree, but it was frozen, it cost more, and they eventually stopped doing it. He filed patents on his inventions. Those patents, by the way, had actually expired by the time they launched DiGiorno pizzas, even though a lot of people thought there was still a patent there. I mean, it was never, they quoted patents, but they were different patents. The key core patent that really was there expired. But, so the science had been done 20 years ago. It just needed the right moment. And I think that's the kind of, that has happened so many times. I mean, I'm sure everybody who's been around as long as I have could give you examples of how they've seen that. So, I think that's really the sort of, you have to have that patience. It doesn't mean that every development is going to take you forever, but certainly some of the more challenging ones, and usually the most innovative and most significant breakthroughs, take a heck of a long time.
Well, that reminds me that you, we'll switch gears a little bit here, because you also make this strong case for hybrid products. Oh. And, that's the blending of the plant-based component with the conventional meat. And so I think, it's interesting because a lot of consumers, they're not really looking at, they're looking to have that more healthy aspect. And so when you can go 50%, right, and get a hybrid product with that meat, some conventional meat and then some nice veggies on the side, kind of 3 meats and 3 veggies and a meat type of thing. Why are hybrids succeeding where these fully alternative products sometimes struggle?
Well, I mean, hybrids, are succeeding in some places, but they're probably not as widespread as they could be. But the first thing is very often the hybrid is just a better option than either on their own. I mean, I've always used the example of chili. I mean, it was actually, I didn't learn it until General Foods had bought Boca Burger. And the Boca Burger was better than anything around at the time, nowhere near as good as today's, but as a burger, I don't want that. It just wasn't good enough, But what I saw our chefs started to take the mince and mix it with regular meat, and they made chilies out of it. And if you make a chili with meat, you really need meat you can hardly buy today. You really should be using, in fact, make a good burger. You really want meat with 30% fat in, which used to be the sort of cheapest meat to buy. Why? Because the flavor is in the fat. I mean, there are many, many flavors that are fat soluble. They're not water soluble. If you take lean meat, you've lost a lot of the flavor. You lost 50% of the flavor. I mean, potentially. I mean, yes, it still has the texture. It still tastes like meat, but you've lost it. If you take the old-fashioned meat that you can still sometimes buy, blend it with, even a relatively simple protein. It doesn't have to be one of the more complex ones. It will actually bind together the less than good texture and flavor of the plant-based meat. In this case, we're talking about usually, is hidden by the flavor of the meat. The texture is perfect. You don't get the fat on the surface that you will if you use the high fat and have to spoon it off. or you don't get your barbecue going on fire. So the combination is often better, and I think when that happens, people will sort of use it. And there are certainly chefs doing it. There are certainly some people marketing those combinations, and I think we'll continue to see them because there is a good kind of reason to do that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about mycoprotein and mushrooms, as you put it in the article, the underappreciated parts of the alt meat portfolio. So, from a structure and functionality standpoint, along the lines of what you were just saying, what advantages do these ingredients offer over plant proteins, other plant proteins?
The first one is that cell-based meats, when you've produced it, they're being produced in the lab and pilot stage now, are basically just a protein. It has no structure, has no flavor. You need the food scientists to develop the processes to give you the texture and the process to give it the flavors. Fungus actually has a cell structure. Most people know that. You cut mushrooms and whatever. It has a cell structure, and it's not identical to meat, but it's not a million miles different. One reason why one of the things my wife and I love is a portobello burger. I'd rather have a portobello burger any day than an artificial burger per se, or I shouldn't say artificial, a plant-based burger. I like real meat, but a portobello burger, it doesn't taste the same. It doesn't have quite the same texture, but it's a great alternative. And there are a lot of people now who are, as I said, blending mushrooms today. Just straight mushrooms, which are, again, sort of fungal proteins and so forth. So the texture is already there, and that's one of the things that really help it. The other thing that's kind of fascinating, I think, is that whilst over, in the US here, mycoprotein is pretty small, pretty, you've got the uses I've been talking about, people doing it. But in Europe, the number one brand, and in fact, the largest market share of alternate meats is plant-based burgers, is mycoproteins, a product called Quorn, which was interestingly developed 60 years ago. Now, it's got a lot better since then, but that's the number one product out there. And again, it's there because people have got used to it. They like it, the taste. It went through an awful lot of consumer negative. All the antis wanted to criticize it, but the Europeans are sort of getting more and more onto that. And again, I think we're going to see that coming. And that's why I talk about the three-legged stool as the alternate to meats between the plant-based, the mycoprotein, and the cell-based, in say 20, 30, 40 years, however long it's going to take. But, and there'll be meat. So there'll be the four different forms. It would be my prediction. I probably won't be around to see them being as big as they're going to become, but that's what I'm convinced will happen here.
Well, we're gonna segue right now into crystal ball time, but not before I say corn is one of my favorite products. Those little chicken nugget style, and they don't offer, as you said, very many products, but I actually look for their patties and some other sort of formats, right? Because it absolutely tastes delicious, and it does taste like chicken, like you're putting it in stuff in it. It just adds that extra, I don't know. I just feel very good about it, and like you said, it tastes good. So anyway, but we're gonna move in to the crystal ball time. So looking ahead, that you suggest that alt meat will only scale if consumers choose it for taste and experience, as you've been saying, not sustainability messaging. So in your opinion, John, what product discipline will matter most over the next decade to make that happen?
Well, it's almost, your question in a way brings my mind at least back to your very first question, because, it's not necessarily the basic sciences that we might think of that are going to be, necessary here. In my judgment, it's going to be how we tie the science to our understanding of consumers. In today's world, we've advanced a long way in what used to be called sensory science or product testing. We combine the chemistry, we combine the sensory science, consumer sciences, And we can guide them with, some of the newer technologies, including AI, and do that. And by doing that, and by understanding sort of the consumers and finding what it is that they're really going to sort of go for in this category, is the key to that. Which you could argue it's a soft science, but it's still the science. So you need to be a scientist to be able to understand it. You need to understand food, but you've got to really understand the consumer. And it's in my mind, it's finding that magic bullet. The environmental aspects are critical in that they will drive it. I think, as I've said in the blog, we won't have the land, we won't have the water. We're going to run out of space to grow enough meat, and as the developing world looks for more meat, there's an inevitability that there have to be alternatives. So people will be to some degree forced to find alternatives. I mean, in the long run, meat may start to go up as a result of that. But again, to me, it's finding the comparison to the alt milk market, which intrigues me here in the States. You may be aware that whereas the alt meat is 1.5% today with everything that's there. It's still pretty big in value, but it's relatively small, tiny, in fact. So it's got a long way to go to get to the predictions I've made of it being 25, 30% or something. The alt milk is already 15% here in the States. And guess what? It costs twice as much, in most cases, as regular milk. So it isn't just price. I mean, it's not out of whack, but people are prepared to pay for it. Why? Well, in some cases, I think they've learned to like the taste better. I don't think they necessarily did to start with. But there's, all sorts of reasons, whether some of them are their belief in the health benefits of it, what they are. There's a combination of things there. But it's finding that sort of equivalent magic bullet. So no, I can't, I'm not smart enough to give, here's the answer, just go do it. If I could, I'd be off doing it and making money. But I think I've learned enough to know, it's that old adage, I'll know it when I see it. Sort of thing.
Right. Well, it has been great talking with you today, John, and we'll keep watching this space. It's definitely developing.
Yeah, thank you. I've enjoyed it too.
John Ruff is a retired Kraft Foods Senior Vice President of R&D and a past president of IFT. You can read his dialogue article, Alt Meats Long Game, in the March-April issue of Food Technology.
Our thanks to IFT FIRST, Food Improved by Research, Science, and Technology, for supporting this episode. Don't miss the leading food science and innovation expo coming to Chicago this July. Explore the future of food innovation and register today at IFT.org.
And that wraps up this episode of Omnivore. Thanks again to all our guests and my colleagues at Food Technology. Omnivore is produced and distributed by the Institute of Food Technologists. If you enjoyed today's show and want to learn more about Food Technology Magazine or how to join the conversation by becoming an IFT member, visit ift.org/membership. For more in-depth discussion about innovation in the science of food, check out IFT's other podcast, Side Dish, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. If you have comments or suggestions for future shows, just send us an email. The address is editors@ift.org. For the entire team at Food Technology and IFT, I'm Bill McDowell. Thanks for listening, and join us again for our next episode.